Well, hello again. Welcome back. I hope everyone's feeling recharged and ready to take in more from our upcoming speakers. On our next panel, we're discussing the retrofitting of NHS facilities to meet zero carbon emissions in partnership with Schneider Electronics. According to the white paper, Delivering a Net Zero National Health Service, NHS estates and its affiliates contribute 15% to the total carbon emissions for the organisation. To support this endeavour, the Net Zero Carbon Hospital Standard, brought in during the spring of 2021, will apply to the 40 new hospitals announced. The government's health infrastructure plan insists on the use of low carbon materials and designs that introduce flexibility in the delivery of care for the future. Brand new hospitals, though, of course, are great to have, but most of the estate is made up of ageing buildings. So how do we retrofit to meet net zero targets whilst delivering the levels of care required? Lots has been done already, including the installation of building management systems, combined heating and power, solar panels, low energy LED lighting, new energy efficient boilers, and better insulation. But what more can be done? So let's welcome our panelists. They are Wesley Thurley, Digital Buildings and Eco Expert Sales Director at Schneider Electric, Janet Smith, Head of Sustainability for Royal Wolverhampton Hospitals NHS Trust and Walsall Healthcare NHS Trust, Alex Pittman, Green Project Director at Alderhay NHS Foundation Trust, Dan Wright, Head of Sustainability at Kent Community Health, and Severine Turgis, Sustainability Project Manager, NHS North West London, ICS. Please do continue to send in all your questions and I'll ask as many as possible once we get going. Gosh, there was quite a lot to get through there in terms of pronouncing different things. So welcome to you all. Great to see everybody. Wesley, maybe start kind of quite broadly to begin with and asking what role does commercial and residential property markets play in our efforts to try and fight climate change?
Yeah, thanks for having me. They have a huge role to play, really, when you think about the amount of the carbon emissions that they're responsible for. Something close to 70%, I believe, so 60 to 70% of carbon emissions are due to buildings, the existing building stock that we have. So really, we have to take it extremely seriously and look at not just the way we construct new buildings, but probably more importantly, it's the operational phase of those existing buildings that are there already and how we operate them in the most efficient way using technology, which is already available to us. That's probably one of the most frustrating things that I see is that we've got all the technology we need to maximize the efficiencies of existing building stock, whether that be a hospital, or a commercial office, or any other kind of building, residential included. It's just sometimes it's the culture, or maybe it's human factors that prevent that technology reaching its full potential.
Yeah, frustrating. Can I just check? Have we got Severine with us? Because I can't see Severine. Have we? Is Severine
So
dropped off?
I'm here, and
Oh,
I
you
don't know
are
if you
here.
can hear
I
me,
just-
but I can't see myself
Oh, that's
either
okay.
in the
As long as
main
you're
on the
there.
main
Oh, there you
stage.
are.
Oh,
Now
here I
now
am.
you've popped up. Following on from
Wonderful.
Wesley's answer there, I was just going to ask you, Severine, what are the key challenges, to decarbonising existing buildings? And I know that is that's a big question.
Yeah, well, yes, it is, because obviously, you're working with what you've got. You're not starting from scratch, so it's kind of, you're trying to be more efficient, but it's not the most efficient way ultimately of doing it. But it's the basics is looking at your building fabric. So you want to have a building that is better insulated, so you waste less energy, less heat. And that's also important when you want to then transition to a low carbon heating system. So if you're going to move to heat pumps, you want to make sure that your buildings are well insulated and you've reduced your heat demand as much as possible. For example, I mean, other, very basic things that we do in the NHS is moving to LED lighting. So these are very efficient lighting technologies, and both in terms of the longevity, but also obviously the energy that they use. And that should be, I think one thing that is really important is that this becomes business as usual. So I think for us, it's very important that you build that in, and it's something that you do when you do your maintenance. And if you change your light, that's what you should go for as a default position, for example. But yeah, as I said, moving heat is a really big challenge. We have some technologies at the moment available, but it's very likely that there's more, in the pipeline. So we'll have to see what is coming our way in terms of supporting the heat decarbonization journey.
Oh, the lighting, and just thinking, we've got 55 or had 55 kilowatt bulbs here that I changed a couple of years ago to the 5 kilowatt. I think I'm talking sense now, but reduced them all to LED, and the savings, yes, it cost some money at the time to have it all replaced, but gosh, the savings are amazing. And that's just in my little flat here in central London. So I know the LED lighting thing is huge. Janet, bringing you into the conversation, can you share how RWT refurbishment and retrofit deliver net zero estates? What are your learnings and what are you up to?
Yeah. I think what we're doing at the moment is, first thing first, is that knowing what your estate is like. So exactly knowing what the backlog profile of it, the condition of the building, because one of the things that we find quite challenging is we have buildings that was built actually back in the 60s where there's no wall cavity to put any insulation. There's no there's no space in the roof to put any insulation. So when you're talking then about retrofitting the boiler system into a heat pump, but the whole building is actually leaking heat because you cannot just, so it's making the decision whether the investment is actually worth putting into those buildings, and actually choosing where the right fits in terms of the investment, which buildings will be the right fit. And at the same time, very, very important is the right technology as well.
Yeah, well, we'll move back to Wesley on that later, because Wesley was saying that right technology is there. But just bringing Dan into the conversation, I mean, Dan, are you sort of, is what Janet and Severine resonating with you? And is retrofitting, do you think, a win-win for both pockets and for patients too?
Yeah, I think, in my personal opinion, not necessarily. So I don't believe that it is that silver bullet necessarily. If we start with the pocket piece, so as we know through lots of the ERIC reports, backlog maintenance across the entire estate of the NHS is huge. As Severine was mentioning, if we're taking a fabric first perspective, then first we need to ensure that fabric is sound. Let's say we make that fabric sound, we insulate it, then we're only tackling the heat issue. Then we can size our heat pump correctly, but then we're looking at the unforeseen consequences that have been seen more and more of summers, which are going to have 40-degree peaks. Then we're looking at an increased issue with overheating. So we need that mechanical ventilation. Really, we need that is technical expertise. They're going to be looking at these solutions, not just now. So how do you solve decarbonisation now, but how do you look at the decade, 2 decades long piece about how do you ensure that these are healthier spaces for our patients? Which is the next part. And we've got the other issue with the retrofit in that, can we really do the right job, the job that we need to do, arguably shutting down these spaces, and when a lot of these spaces need to be open. They need to be open 24/7. They can't, in many cases, be shut to do the work that needs to be done to the standard that needs to be done. So it's a tricky one for patients as well, I think, because in many cases you can't just close it down and then build another one, even if that cost-benefit ratio might be comparable. And then we start to get into carbon embodiment, embodied carbon even in structures, which is a fascinating discussion, but maybe for another time. So I think it's
I think there's a whole panel on that. Poor old Alex has been so patient there. You know how this works, Alex. We've spoken before. Tell us what's happening at Alderhay, and you're working as Green Project Director on a massive plan. Share a bit of that with us and the learnings that you've experienced.
Yeah, so on the sort of energy and retrofit side, our sort of first step has been getting everything we've got to work as well as we can get it to work. And this probably lines up with some of the stuff Wesley works on is getting all of our data to work better and the modelling of the building. So we've got an unusual amount of data. We've got about 1,500 electricity meters, and actually using all of that and squeezing everything as well as possible is a big part. Because what we're trying to do is when we do have to retrofit things, we're actually finding often the time we might be able to retrofit something a bit smarter. So like hot water, lots of hospitals have got really generous amounts of hot water. Replacing it with a low carbon equivalent is pretty expensive. If you can find out with good data you can actually halve the size of it, that's a big saving. So there's a lot of money in the data and trying to be really smart about what we do replace it with. I think overall, as you asked Dan, there's some big money in this. Our energy prices have come down a bit, but they're still crazily high. And energy is the biggest cost saving project we've got in the trust at the moment, and will be for the rest of this year. So I think it's really important with a green head on and carbon, but also it's quite exciting for accountants as well, given the amount of money we're looking at.
Yeah, does that first step need to be better funded? I suppose that probably sounds a bit of a daft question because everything probably needs better funding. But how difficult is the funding side of it, Alex?
I think lots of things we're going to have to do over the next decade needs a lot of money, and we haven't got a proper capital plan across the NHS of how we're going to deliver that. I think short term, there's still really big cost saving opportunity. And if we can use some of those cost savings to fund the next phase of work, that might help us move forward. I think if we're thinking of sustainability as a cost when we're under a big cost pressure across the system, it's going to be hard to get stuff done. If we can frame it as this is a big cost saving opportunity, it might get more things kick-started.
Wesley, I was interested when you were saying that the technology, the innovation's there, but not always being used. What are the blockers on that front?
Well, it's interesting to hear about all the meters that are installed in Alex's hospital, and that's really good to hear. But ultimately, that costs money, doesn't it? So I would say the monitoring of points is really a hugely important factor, and that lays nicely into the digitization of hospitals, of any kind of building. The need to digitize really goes hand in hand, I think, with sustainability, and I think that's sometimes hard to think about if a hospital is facing really huge cost constraints and maybe there isn't a budget there. But there is ways to retrofit in a live environment at a relatively low cost if we think about things like wireless, if we think about things like utilizing the existing IT infrastructure that's already there, so not having to install new IT super highways to carry the data, because it's all about the data really. Unless you can see where the energy is being used, you really cannot make informed decisions. And when I talked about the technologies there, I'm referring to some of the cloud analytics and software that's available to analyze the way that facilities are being operated now, and giving information back to the operators of those buildings and plants, whether that be boilers, chillers, all the HVAC, lighting, etc., to then make some really informed decisions about where to switch things off, where to upgrade, where to really be more efficient. So it's all about the data ultimately, and I think digitization enables that. It's available now.
Yeah, it is. It's complex, isn't it? I mean, Severine, how is retrofitting to reduce the carbon emissions delivered in your trusts? Severine, are you still there, or have you frozen? I think I might have lost Severine. Janet, may I ask you the same? I think Severine's popped off again, but we can always ask her if she comes back on.
actually, with regards to how the initiatives on like retrofitting initiatives has impacted our carbon footprint. One thing that we're doing, like what Severin has done in their trust, is that we make it an SOP or standard procedure to actually replace lighting systems, both emergency and the normal one, into LEDs, and that delivered a huge amount of savings. And they are funded not by capital; they're actually funded through either savings for new work or maintenance cost. So that didn't actually require capital funding. The biggest capital funding in terms of energy that will deliver a huge amount of energy savings for us is our 31-acre solar farm that's actually scheduled to start generating in August. So that will save us a lot of money in terms of, and because it will supply about 6.9 megawatts of electricity to the trust. But in terms of retrofitting as well, with that is that we'd think that it's actually quite an easy thing, but we had to actually upgrade as well our distribution system to enable that energy to actually be distributed in the hospital. So that's why I said we need to look at the right technology, because technology has a way of affecting other systems as well, and that needs to be taken into consideration, especially if we're talking about funding, because if you don't anticipate those costs, that can actually be that would stop project right dead in there, because sometimes you say we can't afford it. So
Yes,
it's
yes.
about it's really about being pragmatic when it comes to approaches in funding or getting your business case in, and having that right priority.
Andy's just commenting, Janet, from our audience. Are the team aware of the fluorescent lamp ban that will take effect later this year? This is another reason to invest in LED lighting retrofits. Also, if retrofitting with LED, we recommend considering wireless controls to allow the dimming control of the new LED sources. And finally, review of emergency lighting at the same time to ensure compliance with fire safety regulations is improved. Finally, with respect to water, there are wireless monitoring systems available to check hot and cold feed temperatures, which can slow instances of taps left running and where overheating is occurring, as well as allowing monitoring, for example, of Legionella risk. Were you aware of that, Janet, the fluorescent lamp ban?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah,
Yes,
I'm sure.
yeah.
Sure. Thank you for that, Andy. Dan, we were just talking about a little bit there about funding. How could the approach to central funding bids for energy transition be improved and perhaps be more equitable?
So, Michaela Shopland was on here earlier with the Carbon Trust, and she was highlighting a criticism that many of us have with SALEX funding, with public sector decarbonisation funding, and that is that it's the first through the door. And as you know, that website will crash inevitably, and it does every single time. And yeah, anyway, so again, as I'm sure you can appreciate, I'm not privy to the conversations that are undertaken around why first through the door is the best approach, but it certainly feels to me like there might be opportunities there for having a way to compare apples to apples and look at a benefit-led or a need-led way to a merit-based way to distribute those funds. So, for example, that could be one, you could look at the current risk to patients that is faced in these buildings which are requesting funds that could be remedied by this works undertaken with a retrofit. Let's say it's not thermally optimal. Great, okay, you're going to be helping out patients. Secondly, you could look at that cost to emissions ratio. So how much cash you're putting in, how much investment you put in, how little is coming out. There we can even look at stick on a carbon tax, stick on a carbon price, and use that as a way to compare across different projects. It certainly feels like there are ways to make it more merit-based. So again, it sounds like PSDS do what they do for a reason, but hopefully in future, alternative funding rounds might look at merit-based to really bring the entire NHS up together, as opposed to just either those with the best internet connection that can get onto the website quick enough, or
as one of our guests said, the one who presses the button first, as you say.
100%.
Yeah,
It's
it sounds
ludicrous.
a bit of a lock. I'm glad to see Severine's back. I'll be back with you in a minute, Severine, to ask a very similar question as I'm going to ask Alex. I mean, Alex, what do you see as the biggest opportunities, and do you want to comment on how we fund them as well? Because if I recall correctly, you're making a lot of savings, I think, at your trust without any capex. I remember that from our last discussion that we had on one of these conferences.
Yeah, so we're making, like we said, focusing on making everything we've got work better, and we've got the complication of being a private finance initiative hospital, so it's a bit harder for us to change some of our assets, but we're working with our partners at the PFI to work out how to do that. I think, building on what you're saying there about PSDS, I think decarbonisation of the NHS is a really big challenge. We've got a decade of complex capital intensive projects in some really tough buildings, and the funding process isn't lined up with that programme of work. I think we haven't really recognised quite how big and how complex this thing we've taken on is. PSDS has been really good at getting some pilots done and getting a few trusts moving, but it's not really a joined up programme to tackle the size of the challenge we've got. And I think we probably need to think across the NHS about how we're structured to do that as well. Is it right that everyone's trying to do this at trust level, and how do we're having discussions locally around how ICS and regionally we do things, because we've all got very similar challenges, and us all working out 100 times in each trust how to do it probably isn't the smartest way. So there's lots to learn, and I think getting the funding to align with that challenge would really help.
Do you want to build on that, Severine, on what Alex has started off with there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm at CS level, and I think so. It's still a new-ish concept, and we're still trying to work out how best to work together, where there's opportunities for ICSs to lead versus the trusts. So there's definitely, space, I think, there for improvement. I think, coming back to what you were saying, opportunities, I think for me, and it's been touched on very briefly already, it's bringing in the cost of carbon. So carbon avoidance, there is a price of carbon. It's in the UK ETS. A lot of the trusts are paying in the UK ETS for the carbon that they emit. So there is a cost. And so there's an opportunity when you avoid carbon emissions. And I think we need to be better at bringing that in when we put together a business case. And for me, the other big thing as well is optimizing your energy systems that you already have in place. So your CHP, making sure your CHP works well and is as efficient as it should be. But also looking at how you can become a more active consumer and prosumer. So when you provide actually services to the grid, so there are opportunities to sell extra electricity to the grid, but also not even selling your electricity, but there's also, for example, demand side response, where you ask to lower your energy use at certain time of the day, and you get rewarded financially for that by the grid. And this is something that we're going to see, looking ahead as the energy system transitions. And all of us, even at home, we've seen it with Octopus Energy. They've done a lot of work on this. But how you incentivize people to react and to support the grid. So for me, I think there's opportunities. Is whatever you have on site, it should work as well as it's meant to work, and also explore how you can engage with the grid. However, challenges in terms of moving ahead is constraints that we see on the distribution networks, which means that you might have a great project, you might have funding, and you might be in the queue to have access to extra capacity, and that can be really challenging. It's a big issue for the energy sector going ahead.
Just wondering, Janet, whether on your solar farm, whether you know whether you'll have battery storage and whether indeed you'll be able to take advantage of cheaper electricity, and potentially, if you're making enough, selling back to the grid as well.
The generation that we have currently is actually just enough for our current requirements.
Yeah.
So there's very, very little storage that will happen. And also, when we're looking at the supply as well from the grid, is we have done a forward planning already in terms of the other, because we're of course installing the heat pumps, electric heat pumps, and then the EV infrastructure that's coming. So all of that has been taken into consideration. And in fact, we are not going to, we still would need the feed from the grid. And at the same time, we would need extra to actually service the future plans as well and the current plans. So
Yeah.
that's one of the things that I would say, that for each trust to be actually aware of what you currently need and what you would need in the future to actually service those new innovative technologies that you're putting in. So that's very, very important. The other thing, just getting into the funding side of things, the PSDS, the ICS, Black Country ICS actually had submitted an ICS-wide funding application, and that was actually awarded. And so there is actually that opportunity to work together and make sure that each trust within that ICS supports each other. And I think the key question there is that the willingness as well of the ICS to put up the money to pull together that funding application, because without that, then it's quite difficult, because not all trust actually has the capacity to pull together a really good bid.
Yeah, and they're complex and time consuming. I'm just wondering, while we're talking about the energy side, Wesley, what impact the energy crisis is having on our journey that we're all on, whether it be personally or within the NHS or in business, to net zero. Oh, I can't hear you, Wesley. I think your microphone's gone off. Just try again.
Yeah. Hello. Can you hear me now?
Yep, I can hear you now. Yep.
Sorry about that. Yeah, it's definitely having an impact. I think when we would put together proposals for our customers, normally we create a return on investment. This previously might look like 4 years to 6 years, or let's say upgrading a building management system. But now I think you could look at a lot shorter returns, actually, because of the energy crisis and the price increases. It's becoming so much more important. And actually, to that point, it really is, I think, those kind of systems that hold the key to a lot of our of what we're trying to strive for here. And if we get the basics right in those very systems that most hospitals have as well, like BMS system is a fairly common thing that you would have, but is it operating to its maximum efficiency? With an upgrade or some enhancements, additional monitoring, it can really have a big impact. So it's back to basics, I'd say, the principles. Then you can start thinking about smart healthcare facilities of the future, and then bringing in some of those even more advanced technologies, tracking air changes in theatres to ensure you're compliant with the regulations, etc., rather than doing it manually. This reduces costs in other areas, so not having to have a human come in and make checks manually. Having technology do those things doesn't mean we're eliminating the human need. It just means we're being more efficient with the use of humans' time. And I think these all combined will give us the marginal gains needed to make an entire facility more cost effective and more energy efficient.
Dan, a quick question. I don't know whether you'll be able to answer this one, but I'm hoping you might be able to. It's come from Steve. Steve says, what are the blockers to third-party finance for decarbonisation, allowing trust to partner with a company under an EPC model, placing the risk on the supplier to achieve net zero? Is that something that you'd be able to take on for me?
I can certainly have a crack, and if
Have a
anyone
go,
else
have
on
a
the
stab.
domestic side as well, I think that's a wonderful idea. So I'm on the domestic side. I'm a big fan of heat as a service. I feel like heat as a service could have some potential as well for our hospitals and our clinics as well. I think, as Wesley was just mentioning, the business offer is the business case better than ever when you consider the pricing, and if this is a win-win, then I think there's certainly potential there. But we'll certainly open it up to anyone else on the panel that wants to chip in.
Cool. Quite well. I was just going to move on to another one if I can. I've just realised there's a few questions outstanding, and I'm going to race the clock for these. Alex, perhaps you can tackle George's question. What are the challenges sustainability leads are facing when departments are heavily pressured into minuscule short-term savings, sometimes to the detriment of long-term savings and environmental sustainability targets? So, for example, buying cheaper, short-lasting bulbs compared to longer-lasting, more efficient but more expensive LEDs.
You've
got half an hour to answer this one.
Yeah.
Have you got any examples that you've come across?
I guess we try and solve some of those problems by having the right governance of the project, really. If we're talking to, so once a month we're sort of talking to our deputy chief exec, our non-exec directors, finance team about green. So I think normally when we take it to that sort of level, we get a rounded view, and it's easier to make the right long-term decision. Sometimes when you're talking to people within the middle of the team, they can only see a bit of the picture. So having the senior team and that governance helps us gives us a lot of challenge as well, but it helps us get those sort of decisions right more often, I think.
And as you're a bit northern based than some of our other guests, Emily's question, Alex as well, do you think there might be a north-south divide for retrofitting and creating sustainable individual NHS trusts? I mean, you seem to be doing pretty well at Alderhay, to be fair.
Yeah, I've had a quick look at the PSDS data to try and work out who was doing the best, and I don't think the North are winning at the moment, or certainly not the Northwest. So I think we've talked about that locally, about what we have to do to change that. And I think actually has come up in some other devolution type debates around, it would be simpler just to give us the money and give us the responsibility for spending it rather than having these competitions. I think that would get around some of the north-south challenges.
That makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Just give us the money and we'll get on spending it. It's simple, but I guess that's really what's required often. Dan, final thought. I mean, how can we put ourselves in a good position to be more evidence-based around retrofitting in the future? Because it's such a complicated subject. I'm sure there's stuff that you're learning on your journey that we could take away.
So there's three things that I recommend. So the first one is to understand what your building eats, what's it consume, and how can you feed that information back to the people that need it, whether that's be estates or sometimes that's the people on the ground, as an incentive to turn that light off. Second, it's understanding how your building interacts with the environment. So that's looking at the building physics piece, or when it's cold outside, what happens inside. Are there cold spots, hot spots? And then it's looking at understanding how patients and colleagues use that space as well. So is there, I don't know, Martin down the hall who's notorious for leaving his window open, locking his door and going on 2 weeks annual leave? So it's also that engagement piece about how do these, let's say, four walls, how do they really work with the occupants? As well known, it's not buildings don't use energy, it's the people that use energy.
Yeah, and it is
so
just finally, Janet, and briefly, but it is also about patience, isn't it? And obviously they're at the heart of everything you do, but also making sure that they're not in their hot, nice, cozy bedroom with the windows open. There's a responsibility there, isn't there, for patient behaviour too, I suppose.
Yes, it is. There is that responsibility, not just for the patient and the staff as well. And also, one of the things that needs to happen is for each of us to look at what not just our current estate, but also making sure that our future estate actually is climate resilience. Because in in the NHS, back in 5 years ago, we have about 2,000 plus overheating incidents. Now we have nearly 6,000 overheating incidents in our facilities. So that's the one thing, you know, adaptation and mitigation is key, and also ensuring that your committees, like your performance and finance, your PMC, your trust board, is actually behind what you're doing. And the thing that will make them actually get behind you is data, as what the other is saying. Data actually supports that. The other thing as well is delivery, making sure that you're showing them that actually what you're doing saves money and at the same time saves carbon. So those are the two things, because for us, the last year or 18 months, we've actually shown that all our initiatives are actually saving the trust money, whether it's only 1,500 or 500 quid, but it is saving money.
Yeah, it all adds up. I was going to give Severine the absolute last word, only because she popped back on my screen, but I'm not sure whether you can hear me still, Severine. And apologies if you can hear me, that I haven't spoken to you as much, but you keep going black on my screen. So I will wind up there on that very positive note from Janet. So thank you very much to our panelists. Another great discussion, I hope you'll agree. Thanks to Alex, to Dan, to Severine, to Janet, and Wesley, and to Schneider Electric for partnering. It's time now for our final networking break, where you'll be able to connect with all of the delegates who have joined us today. After the break, we'll hear from Claire Phelan, Net Zero Travel and Transport Project Manager for NHS England, and we'll bring you our final panel, which is also on travel and transport. See you in 10 minutes' time.